My name is Karen Hill, and I'm in Victoria. Today is the 31st of March, 1984. This is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Today I'm interviewing Mr. Vic Belknap, who's had long experience in social work in British Columbia. Mr. Belknap, in order to get started, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born, and a little bit about your early background.
All right, I was born in Lytton, BC, that's in the interior of British Columbia, on August 1st, 1926. My mother was born in the same town, and my grandparents, who came from California in the gold rush, settled there, and that's how I sprung up there. My grandmother was kind of just a very interesting figure in the sense that she was the oldest postmaster in Canada. She served as a postmistress for 45 years, and she was kind of the nurse, doctor, whatever, in the early days of the town. And I guess that's where I got some of my interest in people. I went to grade school in Lytton. There was no high school there, so my parents sent me to Vancouver College. That's a small boarding school run by Irish Christian Brothers. I left there in grade 11 to join the Army. The Army experience lasted about 13 months, and the Germans, when they learned that I had entered the fray, decided to quit, I guess. And,
Was there anything about your military experience that had an effect on your later career?
Not really, other than I learned the art of jumping leave, usually a half a day before the leave is granted, and that kind of thing, but no, that was not notable. I took my advanced training in Ipperwash in Ontario, and as I say, the war was over at the point that I had finished my advanced training, so I was demobilized in Vernon, British Columbia, and took advantage of the DBA credits and went to UBC. And I stayed there part of the year, and I just couldn't adjust to the university life, so I went to Portland, Oregon, and worked for about a year in a garage. Then I went to Portland University and worked or studied there for 2 years at Portland University. Got married, came back to British Columbia, and finished my BA in 1952 at UBC. I had really set my sights on medicine, and right at that time there was no medical school. As a matter of fact, 1952 was the year the medical school opened at UBC. There were about, I think, 800 people in line for that. And so I was searching around for something to do. Now let's see, it was a matter of my parents, who by that time had a small motel in Lytton, who knew Bessie Mosscrop and Amy Lee, because they would come through and stay there every year. And they, of course, are real pioneers in the social work field. They suggested, when they heard that I graduated, they suggested applying to the social welfare department. That's the provincial department of welfare. So I did, and landed a job then in Alberni. And I really didn't know anything about social work in the sense that what it was all about or whatever it was. But I knew that it was working with people, and I had a kind of deep interest in people, and interest in people sort of in trouble. Like when I was 13, there was a chap in town that was alcoholic, became suicidal, and I kind of befriended him, and that was a kind of good experience. That sort of experience kind of helped me along. I was interested in school and psychology. So I landed in Alberni with my wife and young daughter, and was assigned a general caseload on the west coast of British Columbia. And that area took in practically the whole of the west coast, from Port Renfrew in the south to Hobart in the north. A very interesting area, in that you did it by airplane, boat, whatever. That was the only way you could get from place to place. And I think about 1958, if I'm not mistaken, I then went back on a bursary from the department to UBC.
Could we go back for just a minute to that first job and what you were doing and who your clients were?
Well, in the main, there were clients that fishermen, loggers, a lot of Indian people on the coast, just a great mix of people. The area had very remote spots on it. For instance, there was one little old lady who lived all alone, I think about 40 miles from anywhere. And she lived there since she was a girl. She was quite famous in British Columbia as a cougar lady. She had a cougar license when that's something that the Fish and Game people issue, is a license to hunt cougars, and she was of course the only woman who had one. But it ranged from that kind of person in that kind of location to quite a vigorous mill town at Tassus, where a good deal of the social problems were solved by putting the people back on the airplane and sending them out. But nonetheless, every now and again, the company town manager would call in the social worker, and I'd go in there.
When the solution was to put somebody on a plane to send them on their way, was that your solution
No,
or someone else's?
That was the mill. That was the company. The company just didn't want to. They probably wanted a clean town, and, so that was the way to deal with them. We just fired them, and send them back to Vancouver.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you were dealing with Indians. Usually they're a responsibility of the federal government, but you were involved.
In those days, that's true. Just several years before I came on the job, they were granted they were first of all granted the right to vote in British Columbia, and they won the right to an old age pension, and it was the pension work that I did with the Indian people and the protection of children work, because both of those we had jurisdiction over. Indians used to call me Mr. Hello Goodbye, because I would swoop in on an airplane in a little village and do what was known as field service reports. Once a year, report to the pension board on how the pensioner was doing, and then zoom off, and that's where the name came from. And then it moved from hello goodbye to the farewell man, which was kind of a turn on welfare man.
The farewell man.
That was the farewell man. Very interesting times of the Indian families that were destitute in those days. I think had about, from the Indian Affairs Department, had, I believe, rations worth $10 a person or something, and that was set out as so many pounds of rice, so many a certain quantity of salt, and that was the way the Indians on welfare were dealt with. Had no cash, there were not allowed cash.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the old people received pension, it made quite an economic change in the villages, because here, before the advent of the pensions, the old people were mostly on some form of Indian assistance or Indian relief, as they call it, and were more or less dependent on the band as a whole, and were not looked in very much favor. And of course, then when they got the pension, they were the whole thing changed. It became an economically important aspect of the research.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess won back kind of their traditional status as elders, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Unless I missed something, your training for the job had been sort of limited.
Oh yeah, we had I think, well, I guess it no longer exists in the present ministry, but we had what is known as in-service training, and that consisted of taking about 6 weeks under the tutelage of Miss Musgrave, Bunty Musgrave, and in Vancouver. And she would, there would be a class of probably 15 or 20 of us, and she'd orient us to the job, send us off, and we would then get kind of on-the-job training from the supervisor. The role of supervisor was seen to be a teacher as well as an administrator. And then in about 6 months, we'd go back for kind of an advanced session of 6 weeks. Then we would be considered social workers.
During this first job, when you were doing all this traveling, was it easy to get supervision?
Oh, like base was Alberni. Miss Snyder, who was my supervisor, was based in Courtney, and she would come, I believe, several days a week, or once every couple of weeks. And my traveling would be, because I was based in Alberni, I would take maybe 4 or 5 days on a trip and then come back. So yeah, we would have, I had regular supervision.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of experience on the coast, though, was interesting in the sort of policy manuals as they existed in those days. As small as they were, you were quite a long way from headquarters, and you had wide discretion, and you applied the policy in kind of a reasonable, sensible way, or at least that's what we thought.
Mm-hmm.
The very interesting experience in those in the small communities you developed a very intimate relationship with the people in those communities, and they would call even if there was any crisis, or as soon as you got off the boat or the plane onto the dock, in about a half an hour the whole village knew you were there, and you would just kind of pick up where the problems were and who wanted to see you and where to go. Very interesting. Like you really felt sort of a part of those communities in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
That you're not an intruder, you were a wanted person, and they're sort of on call from it.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of very interesting people on the coast, always, because well, there were people, for instance, who had what would be classed as eccentric people, that would find a little spot somewhere on the coast and build a shack or build their home there and stay there.
Mm-hmm.
And well, just a fascinating kind of class of people that are coast people. Japanese people were, by that time, back from their settlement camps that they'd been in during the war, and were trying to win back their place in the fishing industry, and you feel it into female. And they were an interesting group of people. You know, they'd been through a very, very kind of devastating experience, and were trying to reestablish themselves and gather their families back. They had suffered a great deal during the war years, and there was a fairly heavy incidence of tuberculosis and suicide during those days. And of course, we would be called in that kind of a situation to help the families.
Mm-hmm. What was it like to try to deal with those situations where such tragedies had occurred?
Well, one of the things that a social worker had going for them, or I had going for me, was that they were small communities, very close, and they rallied, and you could kind of gather forces to help them. For instance, in the Alberni Valley was much more difficult to do.
Why was it?
Well, a much larger community. A little fishing villages just seem to have that ability to come in and help people. And, one of the things, I guess, on balance, when there was a kind of crisis, it was a serious crisis for social work. A lot of the things that ordinarily would have been a crisis in a larger community would not have been considered a crisis in those little places. And so a lot of it was kind of life and death situations. Fishermen being lost at sea or sinking, losing their lives and drownings, those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of real tragedies. And like you could turn to the policeman would be doing his sort of police work, but he'd also help you with doing some of your work if you couldn't get there in time, or in within a couple of days because of winter storms or something, that he'd kind of take over.
Mm-hmm.
If there was a family in distress somewhere up the coast, the lifeboat station, I'd hitch a ride with them. They'd consider that a part of their work to take the welfare guy up.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of things extend all the way up the coast.
Mm-hmm.
So it was kind of, kind of exciting, kind of adventurous. You'd hitch a ride on a fish boat from one boat place to another. I was, I guess, the first social worker fortunate to have the use of an airplane. That is, have the department considered that form of travel was necessary and available. On the east coast of the island, the work was done out of a boat made over a fish boat. So the worker there out of Courtney was traveled by boat.
But you were the first one to
Use an airplane.
Mm-hmm. So that must have been exciting too.
Kind of.
Any adventures that happened there?
Oh, the little lady that I referred to earlier. I guess when I was first got in to see her, she had been alone for a number of years and had advertised in the Prairie Free Press for I'm not sure whether it was a companion or what it was, but a chap and his family came up. And I can't recall now how many children were there, but the children lived in a kind of chicken house affair. And the chap and the Mrs. Arnold lived in the main house, and some people became concerned about that, so they called me in. And once more, one had to get there by lifeboat because you couldn't land in that particular part of the coast on a float plane. So I called on her and we talked it over, and by that time, I think she had concluded that that big family was not for her. That was a mistake. And so we loaded the man and the kids on the lifeboat and took off back to Tofino. And he went back to the prairies. But in a way, that's kind of an example of resolving a pretty delicate kind of situation without the force of law. This was kind of personal persuasion. I guess if everybody dug in, we'd have had to, I'd have had to apprehend the kids. But in the 8 years on the coast, I never apprehended a child, which is kind of interesting when you saw your colleagues living. Indian children, some of those children were in pitiable circumstances. I guess as always, families who are in bad straits are. But they would rally, and you could sort of work things out. Well, one of the things going against apprehension in those days, using the Protection Act, was that it was a great big hassle. That is, you had to contact the superintendent of child welfare in Victoria.
Can I get you a glass of water?
That would help, yeah.
Maybe just a second. I'm anxious to hear that story, but
okay, because the authority to apprehend was held by the superintendent under the law and held centrally, in order to apprehend a child, you had to seek the approval of the superintendent, and that had to be either in writing or verbally. And if it was a crisis situation, then you'd get on the telephone, try to convince the superintendent, who was Ruby McKay in those days, that it was such a nature that you had to remove the child. And that was quite a hassle, particularly when you would be in some remote area and you didn't have any telephone or any radio. So,
if you had apprehended children in those days, where would they have gone?
they'd have gone into a foster home. You'd usually, well, there was a pool of foster homes in Alberni. But when you're dealing with a family in Cayuga, for instance, Alberni's an awful long way from Cayuga. And so, I guess the circumstances just kind of made you really examine and rethink and do all sorts of make do sort of arrangements that held off from the kind of hard intervention of the law.
Mr. Bob, over the years, social work has often been thought of as women's work, and sometimes there's been some questions about men who get into the field. Did you sense any difficulties in that?
Certainly in 1952, when I started, that was the case. It was a woman's profession. There were men in the field, certainly, and we had a nice balance in our office between male and female. But I guess the Warriors kind of changed that sort of thing. That is, a lot of veterans were coming back and looking for entry into some kind of profession or occupation. Social work was one of those, and so it was sort of at that edge that I entered. But we were aware of, that is, there was a kind of a male awareness of the fact that this was a kind of a female profession, and always a lot of question of your masculinity and whatever,
Mm-hmm.
or a lot of kind of talk about that amongst friends and colleagues.
Mm-hmm. I imagine a lot of your caseload would have been women too.
Yeah, like the widows and so on. Yeah, they would be. Um, but I think they still are. You know, I think
Mm-hmm.
the women in our culture kind of carry they carry the family, they carry the kind of often the tragedies that happen in families. They're ones that carry the children after broken marriages.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering what it would be like as a man to give advice to a woman who's trying to raise children, having trouble with a kid that's acting up, or husband who's goes
Well,
the wrong way, or something like that.
yeah, I'm not sure that we did all that much real in-depth counseling in those days. The caseload, although this really sounds far out, the caseload there was, I think, about 550. But most of those were pensioners that you really saw just once a year. So I don't, like in the professional sense of counseling, in-depth counseling, family counseling, that didn't exist with like that, or at least didn't exist in that kind of a circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
In the cities, I guess, with children's aids in British Columbia, yeah, they provide that kind of service, and we in the provincial uh, department, we're not all that professional as well. Like a lot of us were working as in-service training, and so there was a kind of a move afoot when I came on the scene to professionalize, and that's how I got a bursary to go back to school.
Mm-hmm. And when was that you went back?
About 1958,
Okay, where did you go to school?
UBC, School of Social Work. I got my BA and then went back to the department.
Mm-hmm. Great. With your time at the School of Social Work, do you have a recollection of the kinds of classes that you had?
I'm not sure that I understand.
Were you taking courses in administration?
Oh, the types of courses?
Yeah.
I can remember casework, group work, there's a psychology course, research and statistics, medical, social work. I'm not sure of others.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a field placement at the same time.
Where did you do yours at?
Children's Aid Society, Protestant Children's Aid in Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a good experience. In the sense that it kind of gave me another insight of sort of city social work and the complexities of that.
Mm-hmm. Did you find that quite different from the work that you've been doing on the coast?
And of course, we just had a very few cases as students, but heavy supervision. That was a good experience.
Who were some of your instructors then?
Oh, Bill Dixon, of course, was heading up the school. With Mary Tadich, Mary Hill was around teaching them. Come back to me, but
Yeah.
it's gone.
Were there other students of your age at that time? You were a mature student at that time.
Most of them were younger, but there were a
Mhm.
couple, that kind of went through the same experience as I did. But most of them were sort of just graduates, BA graduates, carried on as a professional training.
During that period of time, had you had much to do with the professional association?
Well, we were invited in, and yeah, we took a position. I can remember Brian Wharf and I were kind of the student leaders of the first year,
Mhm.
and as we were graduating, we took a pledge that we wouldn't take a job up there unless it was properly paid for.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure which one of us broke first, but it was probably broke in about 3 days.
What job did you take when you finished?
So I went back to the department because I was on a bursary. But we had a kind of militancy about us in those days. And I guess social work has always had a side of it that either advocates or organizes, and we were doing that in those days.
Mm-hmm. During the time you were at the School of Social Work, must have been the time that there were cutbacks and expenditures for social welfare in British Columbia. I think that was happening during the late 50s or so.
There was a kind of a depression then, or hard times.
Yeah.
Well, we had, I've been in the working for the one employer all my career, which is now 32 years. So there's been ups and downs all the way through that. Dealt with in a variety of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting kind of dynamic always happens in in the public welfare field, and that when the economy's up, the programmers have their turn at things, and you get a good deal of development. When there's a downturn, then the money boys, the accountants, moved in, and you get that kind of thing going on. Mm-hmm. We're in a period now where we have strong budget control. The people that have the real say are the so-called accountants. Social workers who are the programmers have to take a back seat.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting dimensions. For instance, there's an ebb and flow in the child welfare services or family services when things are tough, because the resources are kind of diverted over to the income support side of things. I guess that's a history of public welfare, really. In a private agency, those kind of things don't impact public agency.
So are you seeing the same patterns then happening?
Same things are going on, yeah. That kind of overall dynamic that in British Columbia at the moment, of course, the one big serious kind of shift is the elimination of family support service in our ministry, with the demise of 320 or 350 family support workers. And they're, of course, being retooled or deployed or whatever the terminology is into financial assistance field.
Mm-hmm.
So that really is the kind of thing at work.
Mm-hmm. When you were at school in the 50s, was the same kind of thing happening?
In many ways, I think, yeah. We often in those days suffered from quite a serious social work or staff shortage. We went through some really tough times in which you didn't get any replacement for the people that had left and so on. As a matter of fact, that's that whole condition and the lack of resources caused one of the really serious chapters in ministry when the then superintendent of child welfare resigned.
Who was that?
Ruby McKay. She had begged and pleaded for more resources for children. They were not forthcoming, and she then publicly resigned, and there was a substantial outcry from the general community. PTA in those days organized behind Miss McKay. And I think won some concessions out of the then government, but essentially not to the extent that was needed by the department.
Mm-hmm.
We were really dependent just on the single kind of resource of foster homes for children in those days. And she had wanted to build a network of residential resources and so on. And that was kind of a sad period. Ruby was considered as a great superintendent, and still is. She's kind of the epitome of what a superintendent should be, I guess. I'm not sure, whether I'm talking now ancient history yet.
Mm.
Not sure that the present day social work would even know about her.
Mm-hmm.
She was certainly what all of us looked up to as an ideal in social work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she really was the person, I think, that brought child welfare into certainly into the provincial ministry. Children's aids in British Columbia, of course, were always the carriers of a child welfare program. But for the rest of the province, they didn't exist. And Ruby followed on from Isabel Harvey and organized a kind of professional child welfare service in the province. Mm-hmm. Not alone. The director of the department then was Amy Lee, and they together she and Bunty Mosscroft were kind of the big three in the department. One in education, one directing, and one in child welfare, one heading the child welfare program. Mm-hmm. I'm lost now.
Mm-hmm. Maybe that'd be a good place to take a break.
Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Mr. Bellick, when we left off, you had been talking about your time at the School of Social Work at UBC, and you mentioned that you went back to work for the department.
Yeah, I went from UBC with my BSW then back to Alberta for a short time, for about a year. One of the interesting things of that period was that I got myself onto a housing board for seniors, and we built a senior citizens housing project. One of the first ones outside of kind of metropolitan areas.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a kind of a, well, that was an good experience in that I learned the kind of art of rallying community around a project and supporting it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Alberni, because it is essentially a mill town, it's very relatively easy to mobilize, and all the people got behind it. And it's just, well, it's still a very fine housing project after all these years.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It occurred to me that during the break, you were telling a story about something that you had alluded to earlier about the sharing of work between you and between the department officials and the police officials. I'm wondering if you'd like to tell that story about.
Yeah, we were always we always sort of traded off in functions, although I never did very much police work. But because the police were stationed on in a lot of those outlying spots, they would kind of be the front line in the welfare. And I can, one of the examples of that was an old pioneer by the name of Charlie Hughes in the Hewitt area, who was getting, I guess, senile. That's what we would call it now, and getting strange in the head. And he had some kind of fracas with his neighbor, and he had attacked the neighbor with an axe. And the police, and then gone home and barricaded himself. And the police and Charlie had, a policeman and Charlie had always had a kind of a tentative relationship. And he had no use for the police. And so they radioed up to Alberni, and I chartered a flight down, or a plane down. And policeman took me out and dropped me out of sight of Charlie's house. And as I walked up the long driveway, Charlie's rifle was sticking out, cracked in the front window. And I called his name. And I had always had a good relationship with little Charlie, because I guess I brought him the old age pension. I guess that put me in good stead. Anyhow, he wouldn't answer his front door, and I went around the back and pounded on the door, and his big, massive dogs were jumping at the door. As he opened it, he had it, I guess, locked from the inside with a marlin spike, and he had yanked the marlin spike off out of the door and was holding it above his head. So the first kind of sight I saw of Charlie was this marlin spike, and it looked as if he was attacking, but he wasn't. He was just letting me in. And then we kind of talked about a half a day probably, and I talked him then into getting on the plane with me and going over to Essendale, which had a unit for geriatric patients.
Was Essendale a hospital?
It was a mental hospital, or is a mental hospital. In those days, you had there was a legal procedure that you had to go, and you gave up all your rights to property and to a person, really, in those days, when you were committed into one of those places,
Mm-hmm.
which was pretty, in today's light of today's way of handling is pretty brutal, but it was kind of commonplace in those days.
You must have had to do some good talking to talk Charlie.
Well, Charlie, Charlie had, again, I had a relationship over years, several years with him.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I guess he had seen himself driven into the corner by his neighbor and by the police and whatever. So, saw me as sort of rescuing him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How long did you stay in Alberni after you had gone back?
About a year and a half.
Mm-hmm. Where'd you go then?
Then I went on to Abbotsford in Fraser Valley as supervisor. And stayed there until, about, I'm not sure the dates now, about 1958, I think, or 59. I'm sorry, 68, 69.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm sorry, I lost went to Abbotsford as supervisor for 5 years, and then back to university to get my master's. And then from there to Victoria as deputy superintendent of child welfare,
Mm-hmm.
which I think was in 1968.
Mm-hmm.
So what the dates are in that, I'm not sure.
Okay. Was there much difference working in Abbotsford from Alberni?
Well, I was supervisor then. It's a farming community. Considered sort of the warm wound of the province where everybody with problems could live. And that if you're poor and living in the city, it was not as comfortable as in the Fraser Valley. So a lot of the so-called problem families moved into that area. In Alberni, because it was a mining, or it's not a mining town, a mill town, and sort of at the end of the road, people just didn't drift in there and stay. If you couldn't get employment in Alberni, you had to move out. Fraser Valley was quite the opposite. People moved in there and took up residence, and it was an easier place to live for certainly poor people.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of family problems as a consequence of that kind of community, like a very conservative, settled farming community with people coming, sort of intruding in from outside. Very, very good place to work again.
One of the things that struck me about your description of working in Alberni was the personal relationship that you've been able to develop over some years with a fair number of your large caseload. Did you or your workers find that possible in the Abbotsford area?
Not so much, no. No. I guess in the intervening years, we have become more. Well, I think we depended more on a kind of a professional service rather than a friendly sort of relationship service that I began with.
How was that different?
Well, for me, starting a career in social work, I was not encumbered by principles of objectivity and all that. It was kind of a personal relationship building and dealing with yourself in relation to your clients. I guess the education, whatever, sort of had that objective side of it sort of poured into me. And I guess that's always been a kind of a antagonistic thing within me, you know, that like I have a kind of deep feeling that it's really the application of one's own personality that helps. It's not the discipline of a process that is applied that works between people. I'll get where I am in our discussion, but
I was asking you about how things were different between working in Alberta and working in Abbotsford.
In Abbotsford, we had, again, there was a different kind of population, farmers, farming community. A lot of people, that have suffered, Mennonite people. And they had been through an awful lot. Like the Mennonite Relief Society did a lot of basic welfare work internationally, and they would bring poor Mennonite people from Uruguay, Mexico, out of Europe, that kind of thing, and try to settle. So there was a good deal of antagonism often between the Mennonite people and the rest of the population. Mennonite people were very gentle, very ultra-conservative kind of people, kept to themselves. Much like, I guess, the Hutterites in Alberta in many ways. They were a good part of the kind of dynamic of that community. They would look after their own most often, but there was a conflict in their kind of tight religiosity and the teenage kind of members of those families trying to break out of that. We would have that kind of difficulty in trying to resolve those kind of family situations. One of the very difficult times that I can recall in that period was the settling the Hungarian people from the strife that they had in Hungary with the Russian invasions. And they used the Abbotsford airport as a settlement, or as a assembly point for people, the Hungarians coming from Europe and moving them, settling them out into British Columbia.
How were you and the department involved in that?
Well, we were involved in the sense of trying to get them settled. That is, they would find themselves a place to live and find themselves some kind of job, and then that would fail, and so we would pick them up on social assistance assist them through that.
Mhm.
They had a very difficult time during that period because there was a lot of internal strife between them themselves, in the sense that there was a lot of, I guess, suspicion amongst them that some parts of them were belonged to the kind of communist wing, and others were not, and they felt, and I guess the Russians had released the prisoners, for instance, and those people were mixed up in the thing.
Hmm.
Very difficult times in their settling, but they finally settled in.
Mhm.
British Columbia. They've become very fine citizens.
Were the Doukhobors at all an issue in any of the places that you worked?
Doukhobors were not in that time of my career. I first became involved in the Doukhobors later when I was superintendent of child welfare.
Mhm.
And don't know whether you know all that much about the. Well, if you talked to Bill Crosley, he was in the thick of the Doukhobors.
Mm-hmm.
But when Ruby McKay was superintendent, they had one of the how would I describe it? Uprisings, if you like, in the Kootenays. And because there was a section of the Protection Act that required parents to send their children to school, and because the Doukhobor Freedomites withdrew their children from education, that became an issue. And the Attorney General of the day, as I understand it, ordered the superintendent to apprehend those children. They were apprehended and they were put into a compound, I guess, at New Denver, where the Japanese had earlier been kept. And that was a very sad part of Ruby McKay's time. I know that because when I became superintendent, I inherited Ruby's secretary, Margaret Stevens, and she went through all that painful thing with Ruby McKay. When I became superintendent, shortly after I became superintendent, the Doukhobor people had another kind of uprising, if you like, and had embarked on a march to Vancouver from the Kootenays, and took their families and children with them. And once more, the Attorney General and Attorney General's people wanted us to move in on the children, and I guess taking Miss McKay's experience into where I was at that time, I refused. I said that I didn't think that was an appropriate thing to do. Quite proud of that decision, as a matter of fact, because I don't think the first decision was the right one. Certainly, to strike against those people in that way was, in my sense of justice, just wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And so they backed off. but that was the only experience that I had. The Duke Wars then settled into a kind of a ragtag camp out at Agassiz near the prison that was built to house the Duke Wars. And although we kept a kind of running watch over them, we never intervened. That is, in the sense of invoking the Protection Act.
Mm-hmm. Were there consequences for you that refusal to implement the Attorney General's order?
No, I don't think so. I think it wasn't an order, it was a suggestion. And, I think had it been an order, I don't know that they would have ever ordered it. And it would only be speculation on my part of what I would have done. But in law, they had sort of no right to order superintendent. Superintendent was a statutory authority in that act, and that sort of all the rights that the act provided. And I guess if it had come to a showdown, I would have had to go to the cabinet, and the cabinet then would have had to judge which way was the appropriate way to go.
Mm-hmm. We moved from Abbotsford to your time as superintendent, and that's fine. There was an intervening job, was there, between you?
Yeah, I went from supervisor in Abbotsford back and got my master's again at UBC.
Mm-hmm.
And following graduation, moved to Victoria then and took on a deputy superintendent's job. The superintendent was Don Bingham at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
And then he moved on in about a year and a half, and I took on the office of the superintendent. And I guess that became the kind of most exciting period of my career.
What happened?
Well, being the superintendent, many things, of course, happened in that period. But that is a very privileged kind of position. You're the guardian of, I was guardian of, I guess, about 9,000 or 10,000 children. And that's, to me, a really privileged opportunity to be that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things were happening by then. We were into developing a network of resources that, as I said earlier, Ruby McKay had fought for and not been able to achieve. We were at the point of creating daycare program, expanding the kind of parameters of child welfare so that there were more resources that workers had to deal with. Decentralizing the authority, and those kind of things.
Mm-hmm. What was the position of the Children's Aid Societies when you took over as superintendent?
Well, Children's Aid Societies began in British Columbia in 1901, and really were the agency's record, if you like, for many years of child welfare in British Columbia, the only child welfare services. Province didn't get into the child welfare in any real way into the late 30s, and really it didn't come together until after the war.
Mm-hmm.
Really McKay, I guess, took it on. But it wouldn't be fair to attribute Jawalver services to just Ruby. The kind of real pioneers with way back in the beginning of the century would have been the Children's Aid, and they really carried the professional side of job welfare. For a time, there were children's aids throughout the province, following the Ontario model. They never really got off the ground because for many reasons, I guess. One, the settlements in British Columbia are much smaller, but for a period there was the Children's Aid Society in Nelson, one in Kamloops, one in Prince George, one in Nanaimo. Superintendency resided in the Children's Aid Society. And it wasn't until about, I think, mid-30s that the superintendency moved to a provincial position.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that started the beginning of that.
So when you became superintendent, then provincial government had total responsibility for child welfare? Children's Aid Society?
No, we shared it with Children's Aid Society. Children's Aid Society had, under law, the guardianship of the children in their care.
Mm-hmm.
They had the authority to apprehend, and that's much like the that was according to the Ontario model. We essentially in 1901 copied the Ontario Act. The Protection Act that they took from England only allowed the children's Children's Aid equivalent in England to do the actual investigation of neglect.
Mm-hmm.
When the whole idea moved over to Ontario first and then the rest of the country, it had a dual kind of responsibility of investigating neglect, enforcing protection sort of overview, and caring for the children.
Mm-hmm.
So Children's Aid Societies, when I came on the scene, there was a Protestant Children's Aid and Catholic Children's Aid in Vancouver, and one combined in that it was not Protestant or Catholic, but it had been an amalgamation of two in Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
So there were three Children's Aid.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, they had the authority to apprehend, they had and that came in law from the superintendent.
Mm-hmm.
And they had guardianship
Mm-hmm.
by order of the courts. That wasn't changed until the Barrett government came in 72, 73, that era.
Mm-hmm. And was that while you were?
I was superintendent. There had been those as the Children's Aid Societies, as you know, historically started out as a community charity. By the time I got to the office of superintendent, the province was providing about 98% of the budget of those societies.
Mm-hmm.
And there was, over the years, I guess considerable tension built up over that. They were not sort of solely supported anymore by United Good Neighbor operations, and ideologically, I guess, the NDP came in. They had a whole other way of looking at it. So they amalgamated those into the province program and created a whole different kind of model.
Mm-hmm. What kinds of, there must have been so many changes during the time that you were
Oh,
superintendent.
indeed. Well, for instance, when I was deputy, there were no treatment resources. By the time I had left, there were about 800 children in active treatment. There was a phase across Canada, of course, about, of dealing with children and emotionally disturbed children, and in resources like treatment centers, group homes, that kind of thing. So there was that whole development,
Mm-hmm.
very exciting time. The way we developed them in British Columbia was to create a kind of a dynamic between non-profit based and the profit based. John Brown's people from Ontario came out and established a treatment center program here, and to keep an appropriate kind of balance, we had because John Brown's organization was profit, we had a non-profit sort of side of it. That I think gave for a good deal of a wide variety of choices,
Mm-hmm.
wilderness camps, more city-centered operations, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
The whole flower children 60s was like I was involved in some of that, and I guess one of the really shifts in the children's culture in British Columbia came about through the expo in Montreal. That is, families went and visited Expo in '67. I think. Children would hitchhike across Canada. And children started to move quite readily during that era. Again, the '60s flower children thing. So we began to have a lot of children on the move, and summertime children.
Mm-hmm.
Out of that, a kind of hostile development took place. The whole drug scene was a bad, sad situation in those days with youth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was lots of.
As well as the changes that were happening in the clientele, so to speak. What kinds of changes were happening to the people who were working for you in the department? Did you see a change in level of education, interest, commitment, methods of doing social work with kids?
Well, indeed, we became much more professional than the people that we had. Much less dependent on the kind of in-service opportunity that I had. So, most of our staff then from universities, and although there's always been kind of a mix in there. I think that our services became much more directed in a therapeutic way. Social workers had a lot of tools at hand.
Mm-hmm. I guess also during that period of time, there was perhaps one of the downswings, the economic downswings that British Columbia experiences from time to time, and again, cutbacks in social service expenditures. Did that show itself? Perhaps, how did it show itself?
Well, yeah, that doesn't come through strongly to me. I've always had a kind of belief that in hard times and in sort of economic downturns, you can really develop some really substantial programs, like really solid programs. When we're swinging high, a lot of stuff comes along that turns out to be fluff. And, so, like, I guess during that period was the resource development, which is pretty hard always to, it takes, I don't know what it's like now, but in those days it took about 2 years to establish a program, a residential program.
Mm-hmm.
You established it on real solid principles. Less ad hoc-y. When you're up and the economy's good, I think there's much more opportunity to experiment, but often a lot of that doesn't take you very far.
Mm-hmm.
So the downturns, certainly when I was superintendent, I didn't. That doesn't sit strongly in me.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I'm aware that happened probably over that period of time, at least in some places in the country, was the whole idea of children's rights and right to representation and things like that. Was that an issue during the time you were superintendent?
Well, that was a kind of very late 60s, early 70s for me. And I don't know whether I was at the cutting edge of that. I think I was in Canada, certainly. That's one of the really profound parts of my social work experience. I think I'm not sure about the dates of this, but about 69 or 70 were two little girls from Alberni, 15 and 16-year-old sisters. And they had been in the care of the department for 10 years now. And the way the law read, their guardianship was hinged upon the ability of the parents. So after 10 years, the mother had settled herself out of a real sad kind of life experience. She was um, just into one sort of living arrangement after another. I think had a period of alcoholism and so on. But anyway, after about 10 and a half years, she kind of got herself together and went to court for the children's return and won the children's return. And the children were returned, and they in that intervening time had become the daughters of their foster parents, in essence. And a very loving foster home they had. They went back to the mother, or were taken back. They couldn't hack it. They ran away back to foster. We moved them back to the mother. They ran away. Got into a higher court. Mother insisting they be returned, and finally, I guess when you're like in the office of the superintendent, a lot of that sort of is happening, sort of day to day. They, in desperation, these two little girls came to Victoria and asked to see me, and sat down and told me what the situation they were in, and pleaded to be left with their foster parents. At that time I said, no, the law is the law, and we have to obey the law. Your proper place is with your parents, go back, or with your mother. And her new husband go back and try it again. They did that. The foster parents cooperated, sadly. It was like really breaking their hearts. Kids couldn't hack it and ran away again. And ran back to my office, essentially. And I said, no, okay, I'll stand behind you. You're not going back. And then the mother's lawyer cited superintendent for contempt, and that's a rather serious situation. Again, you're upholding the law, and then you're cited for being in contempt of the law. So on the citation, we moved, interestingly enough, into the Supreme Court, into the higher jurisdiction. And the court at that time had no right to, or at least children had no rights standing before the court. But because of the strange nature of the case, I guess, in the sense that here was essentially, in many ways, a court official being cited for contempt. The judge allowed the children into court and listened to them. And that was, to me, well, that was the first time in the sense in law that it happened in British Columbia. Mm-hmm. In that the court had recognized that children have a voice. And the judge, Kurt Smith, who was subsequently deceased, Kurt Smith invoked Chancery jurisdiction, which is like an ancient power that the High Court has that goes back to the Bishop's Court in England. That is, when all else fails, you go to the bishops when they protect the knowledge of God. That's kind of the historical nature of the chancery jurisdiction, as they call it. Very seldom used in Canada. At any rate, Kirk Smith invoked the jurisdiction and invited the kids in. Kids told him what they wanted, and he acceded to that, or had them adopted by the parents, or the foster parents. That was a real milestone experience in my life, in that it really came home that children didn't have any status. They were, if you like, chattels. And other parts of the experience were, it came through very clearly that the Act had never really been fundamentally changed since 1901 when it came in. So those that kind of experience then opened up a kind of a ripeness that when the Barrett government came in, the Barrett government was quite open to listening to me on that issue, and I suggested that the Royal Commission or a commission take place, and they agreed and created the Berger Commission. And, they did a magnificent job, and the issue of rights, I guess, kind of coincided with that whole thing. And it became a real issue in the sense that the Berger Commission came down on the side of creating children's rights in law. Of course, the NDP went out, the present government came in, and by that time the whole climate had changed. And, children's rights were kind of passé, I guess. And, although there's still a struggle out there for them. Some of the things that happened out of that whole thing is that we then had an arrangement with the Attorney General that allowed us to appoint a lawyer in cases, for instance, in marital disputes that essentially developed into the idea of child advocate, court of child advocate. Those were quite informal in the beginning, and then we formalized them.
You were superintendent of child welfare until when? When was it?
That I can't remember because how I was superintendent and how I wasn't superintendent was a rather interesting episode.
What happened?
Well, the Berger Commission, the Family and Children's Law Commission, as it was formerly called, made their findings. They created a climate in British Columbia in which children's rights started to kind of arise, sort of, without the definitions of law around them. And then when the government of the day lost the election and the new government came in, all of that was seen to be a political thing, and so their findings were kind of put on the shelf, as a lot of royal commissions are. The Deputy Attorney General in those days, David Vickers, was in a position where he felt that he could marshal some forces that would still do some amendments in the law, and he gathered a group of bureaucrats together and we began to work on children's rights. We had a change in our administration. Our deputy changed, and at that change I said to the deputy, I would like to take a year off to try and recover something of the Royal Commission on Right legislation. He agreed to that, and I gathered a small team together, created a draft model act. It was put, while that was happening, there were a couple of things that happened in the superintendent's office that didn't win any favor with either the administration or the politicians of the day. One was that while the other government was in power, Vancouver had a remand home that was just a bedlam place for kids. And the NDP under Attorney General then MacDonald finally closed that out, but didn't have a suitable place for the children to go. And there is a prison out in Haney that had been closed out. So the children were placed in essentially a wing of that prison. What happened in that whole thing was very interesting. A lot of the staff that had been there as prison staff remained. The kind of processes that surrounded prison started to seep in on dealing with children. And after some attempts to persuade the government of the day to do something about it, like they would have skin searches and things that are quite common in adult prisons, but as far as children are concerned, it's a horrid situation. So finally, it looked like it was continuing, and it was going to just kind of sit there. A child from, again, Alberni, Indian boy, was sent there. And sent there under rather unusual circumstances, in that it was sort of not a remand, it was almost an order of delinquency. So I appealed it to the Supreme Court, saying that they had no right to hold him there, that it was still classed as a prison. During that whole period of moving that into the judicial process, the NDP government moved out, and the present government came in. And so one of the first things that they were faced with was a superintendent suing, essentially taking an action against the Attorney General of the province. And they couldn't
Were you the
understand.
superintendent?
Yeah, I was
Okay.
superintendent. And of course winning. And Supreme Court judge ordering the Attorney General to take the kids out of there. What they did, of course, is what we bureaucrats are very good at. They declassified the place, and whereas it was under statute as a prison, they just put an order in council in and didn't call it a prison. But the point was made, and then they very shortly thereafter moved the kids into what was the old girls' industrial school, which was much better place as a rehab spot. But that was one of the incidents that didn't win me very much favor with the new government. The other was a matter of fingerprinting children. In law, the police have no right to fingerprint children. It comes under the Criminal Identification Act. And in order to fingerprint a child, well, in the first place, in order to fingerprint a person, if the person is not charged, you have to have the person's permission. Police across the country had taken the position that all they had to do was ask the parent. And if the parent consented to fingerprints, they could fingerprint. I took the position that the police had no right to do that. And again, took it to court. There was a split decision on that, but our minister that day, Mr. Vanderzand, really took issue with that. He felt that the police were right, that it was a matter of controlling the children and allowing for much easier detection and so on. But what the police were essentially doing is they would have some incidents of B&Es or something in a neighborhood. And they'd go to a school or they'd go to the parents and say, look, I don't think your child is a part of this B&E, but wouldn't you like your child to be cleared? And the way to clear that, we have some prints, and we'll just take your child's fingerprints, and that will show that it's not the prints that we have. Which was really, in the jargon, that whole process, fishing expeditions, police would go on. And that was really what I was objecting to. Anyway, that won me no favor with the present administration.
So you had done the review of legislation and developed some
all
law
that was
legislation.
happening at the same time.
Yeah.
I brought forward what I considered was a really the work of the Berger Commission revisited, sort of. While that was going on, our administration was preparing and it was a complicated law statute. My administration was preparing another piece of legislation, which was much shorter, much cleaner. Really just sort of took a lot of the old cobwebs out of the present act, or the old act, and I felt was kind of a dirty deal, really. And the government of the day then produced a white paper of the legislation. They asked me to take it around the province, which I did.
This was based on their draft,
their
not
draft.
on your draft.
I took that throughout the province, had a number of hearings. My ears heard the community being very negative towards that. I felt the community was, the community of British Columbia was very, very aware of the issues because they'd been through a very deep process with the Royal Commission.
Mm-hmm.
And they knew what they're talking about, and I reported that, which was essentially seen, I guess, as an attack on the white paper legislation. So I never got back to my office as superintendent. I spent a period, well, some of my friends called it in Coventry.
Where were you? What were you doing?
Sitting in an office doing nothing. People wouldn't even acknowledge my presence. Then finally, I got assigned to my present job, which is manager of services and seniors. It was a move to promote some better services for seniors in the province.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been there for the last 2.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that was the end of the superintendent's office.
Yes. Yeah. You've had a long career in social work, Mr. Gallup. I wonder, and you've mentioned some of the things that you've done that you're particularly proud of. I wonder if there's other accomplishments that you're particularly glad about that you'd like to share with us.
Now, one of the things I think would be the development of daycare. In British Columbia, we started that all out using well, let me see if I can describe the principle. That's been so long now. I was very interested in Ivan Illich, and I don't know if you know, quite revolutionary thinker in Mexico, who has written a number of books. One of the things that he set out that always struck me as being true is that when we develop a service, we don't usually allow the people that are going to use the service to be the determiners of the quality or the type of service. And when we began to develop daycare, I took some of his ideas. One of them was that you should never develop a service to a person that leaves that person in a worse off position than he was.
Mm-hmm.
After taking the service, one in daycare that seemed to be very appropriate. That is to say, if the state was going to take a new position of caring for children, young children, while the parents were out in the workforce, that service should be of such a nature that when the mother comes home from her, wherever she was, she feels stronger as a mother because of what happened to her child that day. So that was kind of underlying principle. The other principle was the one of choice. And we had seen across Canada, the United States, daycare developing very strongly in the group form. It was essentially developed out of the school model with professionals and so on. And there was a side of that that was pretty ugly, that is a free enterprise side in which you had to essentially the McDonald type of organization of daycare by what do you call it? Where you sell franchise. And that was just in the beginning at that time. So what we then developed as a policy and as a direction was to provide an opportunity for group care to take place, but also home care to create a kind of balancing. And underlying saying rather than putting a parent through the process of entitlement and then arranging for their child to go off to this place or that place. Rather than doing that, we put the person through the entitling phase and then gave her essentially a certificate. And she then could use that certificate in whatever form she wanted, whether it was a group home across town or an in-home care thing down the street. That kind of a development opportunity of a new program was really enriching, and what essentially happened was that we set out principles and developed the program, and those are kind of the principles. And they're still in existence, basically, although I think many of those principles have now been lost.
I wonder, as a sort of a concluding question, if I might ask you, what has meant to you over the years to be a professional social worker?
Well, it's a very deep privilege. My experience tells me that if I have done anything for anyone, and I think I have done some things for people in that period, the most reward has come to me with the person. That is, in many ways, I think that's because I've gone along with the conviction of investing myself. And by doing a relationship with people, I guess the real payoff is in my heart. It's incidental in many ways that somebody else out there is better. That sounds like a very selfish thing to say. I really don't think social work is a selfless type of job. It's throwing yourself into it. And, it's a really exciting kind of thing to. Well, I can't think, reflecting back on a profession that I would rather have been in. And that I've dabbled with engineering. That has its side to it. But social work is a deeply human endeavor. And, well, what else can I say?
Mm-hmm. Well, in conclusion, I'd like to thank you very much for spending time this
Thank
morning
you.
and sharing your recollections and your thoughts and feelings. It's much appreciated, and I know that people will learn from it.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.